It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Officer Daniels had been patrolling for a few hours, the hum of the cruiser becoming a background noise he'd grown used to. It was a little after 2 p.m. when the black sedan appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, he didn't think much of it, but then the car swerved just slightly, almost as if the driver was distracted. Daniels furrowed his brows. He'd seen that car before, parked in the same neighborhood a few times. Something about today felt different. Without even thinking, he hit the sirens, the sound cutting through the quiet afternoon. The sedan slowed and pulled over, its tires crunching lightly on the gravel. Daniels had stopped plenty of cars, but today, for some reason, he felt a twinge of unease in his gut. He stepped out of the patrol car, the sun making the cruiser's lights reflect off the street. He walked to the driver's side, the leather of his boots creaking slightly. As he neared, the window slowly rolled down, revealing the driver. A woman, probably in her 30s, with smooth, rich brown skin and eyes that felt calm but piercing. Her gaze held something steady, something that made him pause for a brief second. She didn't look flustered. She wasn't in a rush or anxious. She looked like she was just going about her day, completely unbothered. There was a quiet strength in her posture, a confidence that didn't come from arrogance, but something deeper. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Do you know why I stopped you?" Daniels asked, trying to sound authoritative. The words slipped out mechanically, as they always did, but something felt off today. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, her voice was soft, yet sure. "I'm sorry, officer. I didn't realize I was speeding." Her calmness made the words sound almost rehearsed, but there was no sign of nervousness, nothing that screamed she was guilty. Daniel's instincts told him there was something more to this. He narrowed his eyes slightly, studying her face. There was something about the way she held herself, like she had seen this dance before. He took a step back, still unsure of how to proceed. Should he just issue a warning? Or should he give her a ticket? But then his gaze flicked to the dashboard, and that's when his heart skipped a beat. There it was, on the edge of the console, a small but unmistakable badge. A badge that only people in certain positions carried. Internal Affairs. It wasn't the badge that threw him off, though. It was the way she said the next words. "Is there a problem, officer? I've got a meeting in 10 minutes, she said, her tone still even, but with an underlying sharpness that made his stomach twist. He froze for a moment, the weight of her words hitting him in waves. His mind raced. Internal Affairs? She wasn't any random driver. She could very well be someone who could report him, someone who could make his career disappear in the blink of an eye. But it wasn't just the badge that made him hesitate. It was the way she looked at him, like she knew him, like she could see right through him, someone who had seen it all before, someone who didn't need to be afraid of a cop. That realization sent a chill down his spine. The seconds ticked by slowly, each one weighing heavier than the last. Officer Daniels couldn't shake the sense of unease that gnawed at him. He had been pulled over plenty of times before, but this was different. There was something about her that made him feel like he was the one being judged, not the other way around. He looked at her again. Her posture, the way she sat with such ease. It wasn't just that she wasn't nervous, it was the calmness in her eyes, the way her body seemed at peace in the presence of authority. She wasn't trembling, and she didn't appear worried. In fact, it almost felt like she had been on the other side of a traffic stop 1,000 times before. She wasn't someone to panic under pressure. It was as if she was used to controlling situations, not being at their mercy. Daniels opened his mouth, but the words felt heavy, reluctant. There was a part of him that didn't want to proceed, but duty called. He wasn't sure why he felt this way. He had been doing this job for years, and usually people acted nervous when they were pulled over. But her? She was different. "Just need your license and registration, ma'am," he said, his voice firm, trying to push the nagging doubts aside. He was a cop, and this was his job. He had to maintain control, but his hands felt a little unsteady as he reached for the paperwork she handed him. The woman passed the documents to him with steady hands. Her eyes didn't leave his, and he felt an unspoken connection there. A flicker of recognition in her gaze, like she knew something about him that he didn't know about her. When he glanced down at the license, everything else seemed to stop. Her name hit him like a punch to the gut. Are you the head of internal affairs? The words slipped from his mouth without thinking, his voice quieter than before, almost a whisper. Her face remained unreadable. There was no shock, no surprise, just a calm, knowing expression. And then she answered, her voice still steady but with a slight edge to it. Yes, I am, she replied. Her gaze didn't waver, and there was something in her tone now, a quiet power that made Daniel's stomach flip. Is there a problem, officer? The words hung in the air, heavier than anything he had ever heard. Internal affairs? This wasn't just a random citizen he had pulled over. This was someone with the authority to investigate officers like him, someone who could have him fired with a single phone call. His mind raced. Had he been watched all along? Was this some kind of test? What was the right move here? His pulse quickened, his mouth going dry. His body froze as the weight of the situation sank in. Ma'am, Daniel stammered, unsure of what to say. His mind was a mess, and the words felt clumsy as they tried to leave his mouth. As Daniel stood there, staring at the woman in front of him, the weight of everything seemed to shift in an instant. Her gaze was unwavering, calm but firm, as if she knew exactly what he was thinking, waiting for him to understand, waiting for him to catch up. Every second that ticked by felt like an eternity. His mind scrambled, trying to piece everything together. He'd always prided himself on doing his job with integrity, on staying professional and fair. But now, standing here, he wasn't so sure anymore. His confidence was slowly slipping away. The woman in front of him wasn't just any citizen. She wasn't just someone he could dismiss with a ticket or a warning. She was someone with power, someone who could have him under a microscope if she chose to, someone who could tear apart his entire career with a single report. He'd always treated people like her, the ones with authority or power, with a certain kind of respect. Yes, but also a quiet fear. The kind of fear that came with the knowledge that they held the strings. But now, as he looked at her, he realized that fear wasn't just there because of her position. It was because of how he had judged her in that moment. He had assumed so much based on nothing but his own prejudices. And in doing so, he had lost something far more important than his sense of control. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest now. The adrenaline rushing through his veins as he looked back down at her license, almost like he needed to reassure himself that this was real. It wasn't a joke, it wasn't some coincidence. It was all real. I didn't know, he mumbled, more to himself than to her, his voice tight. The weight of the moment settled heavy on his shoulders. He wasn't just talking to some random woman, he was talking to someone who could make or break him, someone who had the authority to dismantle his career in an instant, if she wanted to. He could feel the weight of his actions, his assumptions, pressing down on him, suffocating him. The woman, though, didn't seem angry. She wasn't upset. She wasn't here to scold him or belittle him. She didn't raise her voice or demand anything. She just stood there, still, silent, allowing him the space to come to his own realization. And strangely enough, that silence was comforting. It wasn't judgmental, it wasn't harsh. It was almost like she understood what was going on in his mind, like she was allowing him to come to terms with his mistake on his own terms. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, she spoke again. Her voice was calm but firm, her words carrying a weight that he couldn't ignore. You pulled me over for a reason, officer, she said, her tone even, but there was a certain sharpness there, as if reminding him of his duty. And you have every right to do your job, but don't forget who you're working for. Her words hit him harder than anything he had ever been taught in the academy. They weren't just about the job itself, they were about respect. About understanding the weight of the position he held, and how easily it could be misused if he wasn't careful. He had been so quick to judge her, to assume she was just another person to manage, that he had completely forgotten the deeper responsibility he had. Not just to the badge, but to the people who trusted him to uphold it. Officer Daniels stood frozen, his mind spinning with the realization of what had just happened. His chest felt tight, like he was struggling to breathe. He had made a mistake. A big one. In his haste to assert control, to show his authority, he had let his assumptions guide him. He had been quick to judge her, quick to assume she was someone to be dealt with rather than someone to be respected. And now here she was, standing in front of him. A woman who could ruin him with a single phone call, a single word to the right person. What startled him more than the power she held was the way she carried herself. There was no anger in her voice, no trace of superiority. She wasn't here to tear him down. She wasn't here to make him feel small or insignificant. She was simply reminding him of his duty, of the responsibility he held as an officer. And in that moment, Daniels realized how much he had failed to live up to that duty. Not just to the law, but to the people he was supposed to serve and protect. The lump in his throat grew larger as he struggled to find the words. How could he apologize for something like this? A simple "I'm sorry" wouldn't cut it. How could he possibly make it right after everything that had just happened? The words felt inadequate, like nothing he could say would ever be enough. But then, as if sensing his inner turmoil, the woman surprised him once more. Her voice softened, and there was a slight warmth in it that wasn't there before. "Officer," she said, her tone gentle but firm, "you've made your decision, but it's not too late to do better." Daniels wasn't sure if she meant it as a second chance or just as a reminder that it wasn't too late to change, but in that moment, it felt like a lifeline. It felt like she was giving him an opportunity to correct his course, to fix what he had almost ruined with one careless action. He looked at her, still struggling with his emotions, unsure of how to proceed. But the woman gave him a small, knowing smile, one that held no judgment, only understanding. She knew what he was going through, and she wasn't going to hold it against him. "I'll let you go this time, officer," she said, her voice light, almost dismissive in the best way possible. "But remember, not all of us are what we seem." With that, she began to pull away, her car gliding smoothly down the street. And just like that, the encounter was over. The sirens that had blared moments ago faded into silence. The tension in the air slowly dissipated. Daniels stood there, watching the car disappear in the distance, the weight of the moment still pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what had just happened or what it meant, but one thing was clear: he had learned something valuable today. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to do better. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share with your friends. Your support means a lot and helps us bring more exciting content like this to you. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think. Thanks for being part of our community.